The November wind cut through Sarah McKenna's wool shawl like a blade as she knelt beside Thomas's grave, her fingers numb against the cold headstone. 3 weeks had passed since the mine collapse took her husband, yet the pain felt as fresh as the day Sheriff Coleman had knocked on her door with his hat in his hands and sorrow in his eyes. "You can't stay out here much longer, Mrs. McKenna," came a gruff voice behind her. She turned to see Jeremiah Watts, the town's general store owner, his weathered face creased with what he likely considered concern. "Winter's coming hard, and this ain't no place for a woman alone." Sarah rose slowly, brushing dirt from her black dress. "This is where my husband lies, Mr. Watts. I'll visit him as long as I see fit." Watts glanced nervously toward the rolling hills beyond the small cemetery, where dark pines stretched into the Montana wilderness. "It ain't just the cold I'm worried about, ma'am. Them Crow have been moving closer to town. Just last week, young Billy saw smoke signals up on Bear Ridge." "The Crow have always been in these parts," Sarah replied, her Irish accent still thick despite 5 years in America. "Thomas never spoke ill of them. Thomas had a rifle and 20 other miners watching his back," Watts countered, his voice hardening. "You got nothing but that little cabin sitting right up against their hunting grounds. Some say you're practically on their burial ground." Sarah's breath caught. In her grief, she'd barely paid attention to the land around her small homestead. Thomas had chosen the location for its proximity to the mine and the creek that ran behind their property. But now that Watts mentioned it, she recalled seeing strange stone markers and weathered wooden posts scattered through the pine grove that bordered her land. "I've got nowhere else to go," she said quietly. "The mine company's already given Thomas's job to another man. What little money we had won't last through winter if I try to rent a room in town." Watts shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between Christian duty and practical concerns. "Look, Mrs. McKenna, I ain't saying you need to leave permanent-like, but maybe you could stay with the widow Peterson until spring, share expenses and such." "Mrs. Peterson made her feelings about my religion quite clear at the church social," Sarah replied, her jaw tightening. "I'll manage on my own, thank you." As Watts departed with obvious reluctance, Sarah remained by Thomas's grave until the sun began its descent behind the mountains. The approaching darkness seemed to amplify the wilderness sounds, the distant howl of wolves, the rustle of something large moving through the underbrush, the eerie creak of wind through bare branches. Walking back to her cabin, Sarah noticed for the first time how the building sat at the very edge of a clearing that extended into the pine grove. In the fading light, she could make out the shapes Watts had mentioned, weathered wooden stakes driven into the ground, some topped with what looked like bundles of grass or small animal hides that fluttered in the breeze. Her heart hammered as understanding dawned. She was living beside a cemetery, not a Christian one like where Thomas rested, but something far older and more sacred to the people who had called this land home long before miners and settlers arrived. That night, sleep eluded her. Every sound outside her thin cabin walls seemed magnified, the snap of twigs, the soft whisper of movement through grass, the occasional call of a night bird that sounded almost human. She found herself standing at her single window, peering out into darkness broken only by starlight reflecting off the creek. In her homeland, when someone died, you lit candles for their soul. You prayed and kept vigil so the departed would know they weren't forgotten. The tradition had sustained her through her father's death, her mother's passing, and countless neighbors lost to famine and disease. Now, surrounded by an alien landscape and cut off from everything familiar, the ritual seemed more important than ever. The next evening, as purple shadows gathered across the valley, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She gathered her few remaining candles, precious items on the frontier, and walked to the edge of her property where it bordered the pine grove. There, just outside what she now understood to be sacred ground, she placed a single white candle in a glass jar and lit it with shaking hands. "I don't know your customs," she whispered to the gathering darkness, "but I know about loss. I know about honoring the dead." The flame danced in the evening breeze, casting shifting shadows across the weathered markers. As Sarah knelt in the grass, saying prayers in both English and the Gaelic her grandmother had taught her, she felt a strange sense of peace for the first time since Thomas's death. She didn't see the dark eyes watching her from the tree line, or notice the figure that melted back into the forest as silently as smoke. But something had shifted in the delicate balance between two worlds, and Sarah McKenna's simple act of respect was about to set in motion events that would test the courage of both cultures. Dawn came grey and bitter, with frost coating every blade of grass like shattered glass. Sarah woke to the sound of her water basin crackling as ice formed on its surface overnight. The cabin's single room felt smaller than ever, the walls seeming to press in on her as she wrapped Thomas's old coat around her shoulders and peered outside. The candle she'd lit the night before had burned down to nothing, leaving only a puddle of wax in the glass jar. But something else caught her eye. A small bundle of dried herbs tied with sinew placed carefully beside the empty jar. Her heart raced as she stared at the offering, understanding its significance even without knowing its specific meaning. Someone had been here. Someone had seen her vigil and responded. Sarah dressed quickly and ventured outside, the frozen ground crunching beneath her worn boots. She approached the bundle cautiously, half expecting it to vanish like a mirage, but it was real. Fragrant herbs she didn't recognize, bound together with obvious care and intention. The earthy, slightly sweet scent reminded her of the incense burned in the Catholic churches of her childhood. As she knelt to examine the gift more closely, movement in the tree line caught her attention. A figure stood motionless among the pines, an elderly woman with long grey braids dressed in deerskin and wrapped in a colourful blanket. Their eyes met across the clearing, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that transcended language or culture. This woman knew loss. This woman understood the weight of grief. Neither moved for a long moment. Then the Crow woman raised one hand, palm forward, in what could only be a gesture of acknowledgement. Sarah, acting on instinct, pressed her own hand to her heart and bowed her head slightly. When she looked up again, the woman had vanished as silently as she'd appeared. The encounter left Sarah shaken but strangely hopeful. She gathered the herb bundle carefully, treating it with the same reverence she'd shown Thomas's personal effects. Inside her cabin, she placed it on the small shelf that held her few precious possessions, her mother's rosary, Thomas's pocket watch, and now this gift from a stranger who somehow understood her need to honor the dead. That afternoon brought an unwelcome visitor. Jeremiah Watts returned with two other men, Sheriff Coleman and a lean, hard-eyed rancher named Jack Morrison, whom Sarah recognized from town but had never spoken to directly. "Mrs. McKenna," Sheriff Coleman said, touching the brim of his hat, "we need to have a word with you." Sarah invited them inside, though the cabin barely accommodated 4 adults. Morrison remained standing, his presence filling the small space with tension. "Ma'am," the sheriff began diplomatically, "there's been some concern about your activities out here." "My activities?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge. Watts cleared his throat. "Billy Henderson was hunting rabbits this morning and saw you talking to one of them Indians, right there by your property line." "I wasn't talking to anyone," Sarah replied truthfully. "I was paying respects to the dead." Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly from years of shouting over cattle. "You're encouraging them, lady. Every time you put on that little show with your candles, you're telling them they're welcome here. This was their land long before any of us arrived," Sarah said, her temper rising. "I'm showing respect, nothing more." "Respect?" Morrison's laugh was harsh. "You think they understand respect? These savages killed my brother-in-law 2 summers back, took his scalp and left him for the buzzards." Sheriff Coleman held up a hand. "Now, Jack, we don't know for certain it was the local Crow who—" "Don't matter which tribe it was," Morrison interrupted. "Point is, we got enough trouble without some fool woman rolling out the welcome mat for every war party that comes through." Sarah stood slowly, drawing herself to her full height. Though she was small in stature, something in her bearing made the 3 men step back slightly. "Gentlemen," she said, her Irish accent thickening with emotion, "I've buried my husband, lost my home, and been treated like a pariah by half this town because I pray to a different God than you do. I will not be driven from the only place I have left because you're afraid of shadows in the forest." "It ain't shadows killed Morrison's kin," Watts muttered. "And it wasn't shadows that collapsed the mine shaft and killed my Thomas," Sarah shot back. "Death comes to all of us, Mr. Watts. The question is whether we face it with dignity or let fear turn us into something ugly." The 3 men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat again. "Mrs. McKenna, nobody's saying you can't live here. We're just asking you to consider the consequences of your actions. If the Crow get the wrong idea about your intentions—" "My intentions are to honor the dead and live in peace," Sarah interrupted. "If that threatens you, perhaps you should examine your own consciences." After the men left, Sarah sat alone as evening approached. The confrontation had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. She was truly alone here, caught between a hostile town and an unknown people whose land she'd unknowingly settled beside. But as darkness fell, she found herself once again gathering her candles. This time she placed 2 jars at the boundary, one for Thomas and one for all the unknown souls resting in the sacred ground beyond. As she lit them, she whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her, words in Old Gaelic that spoke of safe passage for the departed and protection for those left behind. The flames danced in the night wind, and Sarah felt that strange peace descend again. Whatever happened, she would not let fear extinguish this small act of human decency. In a world that seemed determined to divide people by the color of their skin or the gods they worshipped, she would hold fast to the simple truth that grief was universal and the dead deserved remembrance. She didn't see the second figure watching from the forest, a younger man with strong shoulders and intelligent eyes, who studied her ritual with growing curiosity. Nor did she notice when he slipped away to report what he'd witnessed to the tribal council, carrying news that would soon change the delicate balance of the frontier forever. Snow began falling 3 days later, fat flakes that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Sarah watched from her window as the white blanket covered the burial markers, softening their stark silhouettes until they looked like sleeping forms beneath the pines. Her food supplies were running dangerously low. The confrontation with Morrison and his allies had made shopping in town an ordeal. Conversations stopped when she entered the general store, and Watts had begun charging her inflated prices while claiming his regular suppliers were having trouble with Indian raids on the freight wagons. But each evening, she continued her vigil, and each morning she found new gifts beside the burned-out candles, sometimes sage bundles, other times small carved pieces of wood or bone, once a handful of dried berries that tasted sweet and sustaining when she cautiously tried them. The silent exchange had developed its own rhythm. Sarah would light her candles and whisper her prayers, and by dawn, someone would have left tokens of acknowledgement. She began leaving small offerings of her own, a wooden cross Thomas had carved for her, some of her precious tea leaves wrapped in cloth, once a small mirror that had belonged to her mother. On the 4th day of snow, everything changed. Sarah was splitting kindling behind her cabin when she heard voices, not English but the melodic, unfamiliar cadences of the Crow language. She froze, axe raised halfway through its arc, as 3 figures emerged from the tree line. The elderly woman from before led the group, flanked by a young man with powerful shoulders and watchful eyes, and another woman who appeared to be middle-aged, her face marked by old grief but also strength. They approached slowly, hands visible and empty, stopping at the exact spot where Sarah had been placing her candles. The older woman, Ayana, though Sarah didn't know her name yet, spoke in accented but clear English. "You honor our dead." Sarah set down the axe carefully, her heart pounding. "I honor all who have passed," she replied. "Death knows no boundaries." Ayana nodded slowly. "Your man, he is in the ground near the town?" "Yes." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "The mine, there was a collapse." The younger man, Takoda, spoke in Crow to his companions, then switched to English. "We know of this place where white men dig. The earth bleeds black blood there." "Black blood?" Sarah frowned, then understood. "The coal." "Yes, that's what my husband mined." The middle-aged woman stepped forward. Sarah could see now that her left arm ended at the wrist, an old injury that had healed but left her forever changed. "I am Kimimila," she said quietly. "My son died in the time of deep snow. 2 winters passed. He was trying to help white travelers lost in storm. The travelers lived. My son did not." The simple statement hung in the cold air like a bridge between worlds. Sarah felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she recognized the familiar weight of loss in the other woman's voice. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so very sorry." Ayana gestured toward the burial ground. "Kimimila comes here every day since her boy crossed over. She saw your lights, your prayers. She asked us to speak with you." "Your offerings," Dakota added, "they show respect, but also sadness. Ayana says you carry the weight of mountains." Sarah laughed, but it came out as more of a sob. "I don't know how to carry it," she admitted. "In my country we had ways, rituals, community. Here, I'm alone." Ayana finished gently. "Yes, we understand alone." The 4 women stood in silence as snow continued to fall around them. Sarah realized this was the longest conversation she'd had with anyone since Thomas's funeral, and certainly the most honest. "The men from town," Kimimila said eventually. "They came to see our chief yesterday. They say you bring danger, encourage our warriors to raid." Sarah's blood chilled. "That's not true. I would never—" "We know," Takoda interrupted. "We watch. We see. You light candles, you pray, you leave gifts of peace. This is not the way of someone who seeks war. Ayana pulled a small leather pouch from beneath her blanket. Sage, she explained, offering it to Sarah. For cleansing grief, for honoring spirits. White sage is sacred to our people, but all sage carries power to heal the heart. Sarah accepted the pouch with trembling hands. Thank you. I don't know your customs. I hope I haven't offended. Grief has no color, Kimimila said firmly. Pain has no tribe. You understand this. Many do not. As the three crow prepared to leave, Ayana turned back to Sarah. The men from town, they fear what they do not understand. Fear makes people dangerous. You should know this. Are you warning me? Sarah asked. We are telling you truth, Takoda replied. Watch the sky. When ravens gather in great numbers, trouble comes with them. After they left, Sarah stood alone in the falling snow, clutching the sage pouch to her chest. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she didn't feel completely isolated. The conversation had been brief, but it had opened a door she hadn't even known existed. That evening, as she prepared her usual vigil, Sarah used some of the gifted sage alongside her candles. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying her prayers toward stars just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She was so focused on her ritual that she almost missed the sound of approaching horses. By the time she heard the hoofbeats and muffled voices, they were already close. Sarah quickly extinguished her candles and retreated toward her cabin, but not before catching sight of several riders silhouetted against the snow-covered landscape. One of the voices carried clearly in the cold air. Jack Morrison's distinctive growl told you she was still doing it, signaling them every damn night. Sarah's hands shook as she barred her door and checked that Thomas's old rifle was loaded. The peaceful interlude with Ayana, Kimimila, and Takoda had given her hope that understanding was possible between different peoples, but as the riders circled her property in the darkness, she realized that hope might not be enough to protect her from those who profited from keeping the two worlds apart. Outside, the horses stamped and snorted in the cold, and Sarah heard Morrison's voice again. Time somebody taught this Irish witch that there are consequences for consorting with savages. Sarah spent the night huddled in her cabin's single chair, Thomas's rifle across her knees, and her ears straining for any sound beyond the wind. Morrison's men had eventually ridden away, but not before circling her property 3 times and shouting threats that made her blood run cold. She'd counted at least 5 distinct voices, including Watts and someone who sounded like Billy Henderson, the young man who'd first reported seeing her consorting with Indians. Dawn brought an ominous sight. Dozens of ravens perched in the bare branches around her cabin, their black forms stark against the snow-covered pines. As Sarah watched through her frost-covered window, more arrived, until the trees seemed heavy with dark, watchful eyes. Takoda's warning echoed in her mind. When ravens gather in great numbers, trouble comes with them. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. She approached cautiously, rifle ready, but the voice that called out was unexpected. Mrs. McKenna, it's Dr. Samuel Hayes. I need to speak with you. Sarah recognized the name, the town's only doctor, a man she'd met briefly at Thomas's funeral. She opened the door to find a tall, scholarly-looking man in his 50s, his medical bag slung over one shoulder, and concern etched across his weathered features. Dr. Hayes, she said, lowering the rifle, what brings you out here so early? May I come in? What I have to say isn't for public consumption. Once inside, Hayes accepted a cup of weak tea and studied Sarah's pale, exhausted face. You look like you haven't slept, he observed. Hard to sleep when men with guns are circling your home, Sarah replied bluntly. Hayes sighed deeply. That's partly why I'm here. Mrs. McKenna, I need to warn you, there's talk in town, dangerous talk. Morrison's been spreading stories about you summoning war parties with your evening activities. That's ridiculous and you know it. Of course I know it, Hayes agreed. But truth doesn't matter when fear takes hold. Half the town is convinced you're some kind of witch or Indian spy. The other half thinks you're just a grief-mad woman who doesn't understand the danger she's creating. Sarah set down her teacup with shaking hands. What are you suggesting I do? Abandon the only home I have left? I'm suggesting you consider the reality of your situation. Hayes leaned forward earnestly. Morrison lost family to Indian raids. His hatred runs deep. Watts sees profit in conflict. It drives up prices and makes people dependent on his store. Even Sheriff Coleman is under pressure from the territorial governor to maintain order along the frontier. And what about you, Doctor? Where do you stand? Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. "I've treated wounded from both sides of this conflict, Mrs. McKenna. I've seen Crow children with bullet wounds and white settlers with arrow injuries. I've watched mothers, both Indian and white, weep over their dead sons. Pain looks the same regardless of skin color." "Then you understand why I can't stop honoring the dead." "I understand your motivations," Hayes said carefully. "But I also understand that your actions, however well-intentioned, are being used to justify violence. Morrison's organizing a militia. He's convinced the territorial authorities that the local Crow are planning a winter offensive." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Based on what evidence? Based on reports of increased Indian activity near town, signals being sent at night, white women collaborating with hostiles. Hayes met her eyes directly. "You're not the only target, but you're the most visible one." Before Sarah could respond, both she and Hayes heard the sound they'd both been dreading. Hoofbeats approaching fast. Hayes moved to the window and cursed under his breath. "Morrison's back," he said grimly, "and he's brought more men this time." Sarah counted at least 8 riders as they formed a semicircle in front of her cabin. Morrison sat his horse in the center, a new Colt revolver prominent on his hip. Beside him, Sheriff Coleman looked deeply uncomfortable, but made no move to intervene. "Mrs. McKenna," Morrison called out, "we know you're in there. Time for a reckoning." Hayes squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "Let me talk to them," he said quietly. "No." Sarah's voice was steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "This is my home. I'll face them myself." She opened the door and stepped outside, noting how the ravens in the surrounding trees seemed to grow more agitated as the tension increased. Their cawing created an almost supernatural chorus that made several of Morrison's men shift nervously in their saddles. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, proud that her voice didn't shake, "to what do I owe this visit?" Morrison's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "Heard you had more visitors yesterday. Crow, by all accounts, right here on your property." "I spoke with some people, yes. Neighbors, you might say." "Neighbors?" Morrison's laugh was harsh. "Lady, those neighbors of yours killed 3 freight haulers just south of Bear Ridge 2 days ago, took their scalps and burned the wagons." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain steady. "How do you know it was the same people?" "Because," Sheriff Coleman said reluctantly, "one of the survivors lived long enough to describe the attackers, including an old Indian woman with gray braids and a young buck with a scar on his left cheek." Sarah's mind raced. The description could fit Ayanna and possibly Takoda, though she hadn't noticed any scar. But the people she'd spoken with had shown nothing but respectful solemnity. Could they really have been involved in violence? "Even if that's true," she said carefully, "what does it have to do with me?" "Everything," Morrison snarled, dismounting from his horse. "You've been signaling them, telling them when freight comes through, when the town's defenses are weak. You're a goddamn spy." "That's enough." Dr. Hayes emerged from the cabin, his medical bag in hand. "Jack Morrison, I've known you since you were a boy, and your father would be ashamed to see you terrorizing a widow. My father's dead because of Indians, Doc, and this woman's helping them kill more good people. The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment something extraordinary happened. A single raven landed on Sarah's shoulder, its claws gripping her shawl without piercing the fabric. The bird fixed its intelligent black eyes on Morrison and let out a series of harsh calls that seemed almost like a challenge. The effect on Morrison's men was immediate and unsettling. Horses began to dance nervously, and several of the riders made the sign of the cross. In frontier communities where superstition ran as deep as faith, a raven choosing to perch on a person was considered either a powerful blessing or a terrible omen. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. "Look at them birds." Sarah glanced around and gasped. The ravens weren't just in the trees anymore, they were everywhere, perched on her roof, lining the fence posts, covering the ground like a living black carpet. Hundreds of them, all watching the confrontation with an almost human intelligence. Morrison's face had gone pale, but his hatred burned brighter than his fear. "Witch," he hissed. "I knew it. You're summoning demons to protect you." "I'm not summoning anything," Sarah said quietly, though even she was unnerved by the raven's behavior. "Sometimes nature shows us things we need to see." The raven on her shoulder cawed once more, then took flight, leading a massive exodus as hundreds of its companions rose into the grey sky like a black storm cloud. Within moments they were gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to press against everyone present. Sheriff Coleman was the first to speak. "Mrs. McKenna," he said formally. "I'm placing you under protective custody, for your own safety and for the safety of this community." "On what charges?" Dr. Hayes demanded. "Suspicion of aiding hostile Indians," Coleman replied, "and for her own protection from misunderstandings." As the sheriff's words sank in, Sarah realized that her world was about to change again. The fragile peace she'd found in her grief rituals, the tentative connection she'd made with Ayana and her people, the small hope that understanding might bridge the gap between cultures, all of it was crumbling around her, like the walls of a house built on shifting ground. The jail cell in town was barely large enough for a cot and a chamber pot, its single barred window offering a view of the main street where curious townspeople gathered to stare at the Indian witch. Sarah had been imprisoned for 3 days when Dr. Hayes brought disturbing news during one of his permitted visits. "The territorial militia is coming," he said quietly, glancing toward the sheriff's office where Coleman sat pretending not to eavesdrop. "Morrison sent word to Fort Ellis claiming there's an imminent Crow uprising. They'll be here within the week." Sarah gripped the cell bars until her knuckles went white. "This is madness, Doctor. I lit candles to honor the dead, nothing more. I know that, and so does Sheriff Coleman, though he won't admit it publicly. But Morrison's convinced half the territory that you're the key to some grand Indian conspiracy." Hayes lowered his voice further. "There's something else. The Crow have been asking about you." "Asking what?" "Where you are. Why you've stopped coming to the burial ground. Ayana herself came to the edge of town yesterday with 2 warriors. She wanted to know if you were dead." Sarah's heart ached at the thought of the elderly woman worrying about her. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're being held against your will by frightened men who see enemies in every shadow." Hayes paused. "She said something strange before she left. She said the dead are restless when their guardian disappears." That night, Sarah lay on the thin cot, listening to the sounds of a town preparing for war. Men called out to each other as they reinforced the general store's windows with boards. Horses stamped and whinnied as riders arrived with reports from the surrounding countryside. And underneath it all, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of hammering as someone built what could only be a gallows in the town square. The next morning brought Sheriff Coleman with an unexpected proposal. "Mrs. McKenna," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion, "I'm going to give you a choice. Morrison's got the town council convinced you should be tried for treason against the territory. Doc Hayes has been arguing for your release, but—" He gestured helplessly toward the window, where the half-finished gallows was visible. "What kind of choice?" Sarah asked. "I can release you on condition that you leave Montana immediately. There's a stage heading east day after tomorrow. I'll put you on it with enough money to reach St. Louis, and this whole nightmare ends." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. The offer meant safety, a chance to start over somewhere far from frontier violence and racial hatred. But it also meant abandoning the only place where Thomas rested, the sacred ground where she'd found unexpected kinship with people who understood loss. "And if I refuse?" Coleman's face was grim. "Then you stand trial. And with the mood this town's in." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Before Sarah could answer, commotion erupted outside, shouts, running footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of weapons being readied. Coleman rushed to the window and cursed. "They're here," he said. "The Crow." But not the way Morrison expected. Sarah pressed her face to the bars and gasped. The main street was filled with Crow people, but they weren't armed for war. Instead, they came in a solemn procession. Elderly women and men, mothers carrying babies, young people walking with quiet dignity. At their head walked Ayana, Takoda, and Kimimila, each carrying bundles of sage and wearing their finest ceremonial clothing. Morrison appeared in the street, his militia men flanking him with rifles raised. "That's far enough," he shouted. "State your business or get out." Ayana stepped forward alone, her aged voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "We come to honor one who honors our dead. We come in peace, seeking the woman with yellow hair who lights candles for spirits not her own." "The witch stays locked up," Morrison snarled, "and you savages need to clear out before—" His words were cut off as Takoda spoke in rapid Crow, and suddenly every person in the procession placed their bundles of sage on the ground and sat down in the street. It was a powerful gesture of non-violent resistance that left Morrison's armed men uncertain how to respond. Dr. Hayes appeared at Coleman's shoulder. "Sheriff, you need to see this. They're not just sitting, they're mourning. This is a funeral procession." Sarah watched in amazement as the Crow people began a low, haunting chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Some of the townspeople who had come out to gawk began to back away, sensing something sacred and profound. that transcended their fear and prejudice. Kimimila rose from her seated position and approached the jail, stopping just outside rifle range. In perfect English, she called out, "Sarah McKenna, daughter of grief, the spirits of our ancestors call for you. Will you come and complete the bridge between worlds?" Morrison raised his rifle. "Nobody moves. Sheriff, get these Indians out of here before you what, Jack?" Dr. Hayes stepped into the street, his medical bag in hand and his voice ringing with authority. "Before you murder peaceful people conducting a religious ceremony? Before you destroy any chance of peace in this valley? They killed those freight haulers," Morrison shouted. "They're planning to massacre the whole town." "No," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see a crow man Sarah didn't recognize, elderly but strong, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He spoke English with careful precision. "I am Chief Running Bear. The men who attacked your wagons were not of our band. They were Lakota warriors driven south by the harsh winter, seeking supplies for starving families." The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Morrison's face reddened with rage or embarrassment, possibly both. "How you expect us to believe?" he began. "I expect nothing," the chief interrupted calmly, "but I offer truth. The woman you hold prisoner has done nothing but show respect for our sacred places and our dead. She has built a bridge of understanding with her simple acts of kindness. To punish her is to punish the very peace you claim to want." Sheriff Coleman looked from the peaceful crow gathering to Morrison's angry militia, then to Sarah in her cell. The weight of decision was clear in his weathered features. "Mrs. McKenna," he said finally, "I'm releasing you into the custody of Dr. Hayes. This has gone far enough." As Coleman unlocked the cell, Morrison exploded. "You can't do this. She's a traitor, a spy." "She's a grieving widow who lit candles for the dead," Coleman replied firmly. "And if that's treason, then we've lost our souls along with our sense." Sarah emerged from the jail into the grey afternoon, her legs shaky from days of confinement. The Crow people rose as one when they saw her, and Ayana approached with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Daughter," the old woman said softly, "the spirits told us you were trapped by those who fear what they do not understand. We came to bring you home." "Home?" Sarah whispered. Kimimila stepped forward, holding out a beautiful beaded necklace. "Among our people, when someone shows great respect for our ways, we offer them a place in our family. You have grieved with us, honored our dead alongside your own. If you wish it, you need never be alone again." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her. Crow people who had risked confrontation to secure her freedom, Dr. Hayes who had stood up for truth despite the danger, even Sheriff Coleman who had chosen justice over political expediency. And beyond them, she saw some of the townspeople watching with expressions that suggested Morrison's hatred wasn't universal. "What about the bridge Kimimila mentioned?" Sarah asked. Chief Running Bear smiled. "The bridge between our peoples has always existed in the realm of the spirits. You have made it visible in the world of the living. If you are willing, you could help both our communities learn that peace is stronger than fear." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Sarah made her choice. She would not flee to St. Louis to hide from frontier violence. Instead, she would stay and tend the sacred bridge she had accidentally created, lighting candles not just for Thomas and the Crow ancestors, but for the possibility that two different worlds might learn to share the same sky. The last image of that day was one that would be talked about for generations. Sarah McKenna, walking between Ayana and Kimimila toward the pine grove where it all began, followed by a procession of Crow families and several townspeople who had found the courage to cross the invisible line that had divided their community. Above them, a single raven circled in the darkening sky, its wings catching the last light as if blessing the fragile peace that had emerged from the ashes of fear and misunderstanding. In the cemetery where Thomas rested, someone had already lit a candle, and in the sacred grove beyond, Sarah could see the flicker of other flames, a constellation of small lights honoring all the dead, regardless of the color of their skin or the gods they had worshipped in life.